Isn't the best, let me just pose this question to the panel. Maybe I should start with you, Professor Franks, but isn't the best way to address the many abuses that we're seeing by the big tech companies? And we've talked about some of them today. CSAM, Professor Freed, you mentioned CSAM. That's got to be one of the leading ones. I'm a father of 3 children, all of them very small. I worry about this every day. As my oldest is 10, as they get old enough to want to be on the internet. There are other abuses, the videos that promote suicide, the videos that promote violence, and we could go on and on. Isn't the best way to deal with that just to allow people to get into court and hold these companies accountable? Here's what I've learned in my short time in the Senate, is that we can write regulations and we can give the various regulatory agencies the power, whether it's the FTC or others, the power to enforce them. But my experience is, my observation is that the big tech companies tend to own the regulators at the end of the day. I mean, no offense to any of the regulators who are watching this, but you know I'm right. At the end of the day, it's a revolving door. They go to work for the big tech companies. They come out of employment and go into the government, and it's just amazing how the regulators always seem to end up on the side of tech. And for that matter, even when they do fine tech, even if it's a big fine, Meta got fined, I think, $1 billion a couple of years ago. They didn't care, didn't change anything. That's nothing to them. Their revenues are massive. Their profits are massive. But what strikes fear into their hearts is if you say, oh, but we'll allow plaintiffs to go to court. We take the big tobacco example. What finally changed the behavior of big tobacco? Lawsuits. Normal people got into court, class action suits. So isn't that really what we're talking, just to simplify this, isn't that what we're really talking about today? I mean, the thing that we ought to be doing is figuring out a way, and you proposed a way, Professor Franks, I was just reviewing your written testimony here a second ago with the changes you would make to the statute. But the gist of that is to create a system and a standard that is equitable in terms of being it's the same across the board for everybody. You don't single out one particular piece of conduct. You would just change the standard. But the point of it is people would be able to, using this standard, to get into court, to have their day in court, and to hold these companies accountable. Is that fair to say? Is that too simplified?
I think that is fair to say, that as you're pointing out, litigation is one of the most powerful ways to change an industry. And it's not just because of the ultimate outcome of those cases, but also because of the discovery in those cases. What we get to see, instead of having to wait for whistleblowers or wait for journalists, is actually the documents themselves, internal documents about what you knew, when you knew it, and what you were doing. And so I think that exactly for this reason, we have to be interpreting Section 230 as not providing some kind of supercharged immunity that no other industry gets, but actually, yes, allow people who have been harmed to get into court, make their claim. They may not prevail, they might, but at any event, we will see some public service also in terms of the discovery process that shows us what these companies are doing, and to the tune of how much money. Because a lot of what is being said about the distinctions between the big corporations and the little ones, how did the big corporations get so big? Because they didn't get sued. And so if we care about that kind of monopolization, if we care about that kind of disproportionate influence, what will benefit the entire market is actually letting those companies be sued if they have caused harm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And with all due respect to you, Mr. Sullivan, I know you have an obligation to represent the people for whom you work, but I would just say it's pretty hard to argue that the social media landscape, the social media industry right now, for example, is a good example of a competitive industry. It's not particularly competitive at all. It's controlled overwhelmingly by 1 or 2 players. It is the very quintessence of monopoly. I mean, you have to go back over a century in this country's history to find similar monopolization. And to Professor Frank's point, I think you can make a very strong argument that Section 230 and the incredible immunity that it has provided for a handful of players has contributed to this monopolization. It is, in effect, a massive government subsidy to the tune of billions of dollars a year. So I'll just say that, listen, as a conservative Republican, I mean, I'm going to be clear about this. I am a conservative Republican. I believe in markets. I am skeptical of massive regulatory agencies, but one of the reasons I'm skeptical is I just see them get captured time after time after time. But I believe in the right of people to be heard and to be vindicated and to have their days in court. And I think the best way you protect the little guy and give him the power or her the power to take on the big guy is allow them into court. Let them get discovery. Let them hire a tort lawyer. Let them bring their suits. And you're right, Professor Franks, maybe they win, maybe they don't. That's justice, right? It'll be a fair, even-handed standard. The last thing I would say is that I think that's actually much closer to what Section 230, when Congress wrote it, was meant to be. If you look at the language of 230, it's been interpreted by courts to provide this super immunity, as you were saying, Professor Franks. I think it's very arguable, and this is the argument I made in the Google case in my amicus brief, was that, listen, what it really was meant to do is preserve distributor liability. There's a baseline at the common law of distributor liability that says if a distributor who doesn't originate the speech but merely hosts it and distributes it, they can't be liable for somebody else's speech and shouldn't be. I think we all agree on that, only if they promote speech that they know is unlawful or should have known as unlawful, regardless of the nature of the speech, which gets to your point, Professor Franks. Whatever category you want, if it's unlawful, they know it, they should have known it, then under traditional distributor liability, then and only then they can be liable. But what's happened is the courts have obviously swept that away completely now too, in 230, bars even that form of liability. Surely we can agree that there should be, whether it's the standard you propose, Professor Franks, which I think is pretty close actually to traditional distributor liability, we could find a way to allow people to have their basic claims vindicated, to hold accountable these companies when they are actively promoting harmful content that they know or should know is harmful. And I would just submit that's the best way forward here. And I look forward with working with the chairman here as we continue to gather information and try to put forward proposals that will do that in a meaningful way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.